Late February, somewhere in the English Midlands. The ground behind a small cottage is frozen hard enough to ring under a boot heel. There is a woman out there in the gray light, and she is not digging. She walks to the second bed, bends down, and takes 4 outer leaves off a kale plant that has been standing in that same spot since the March before last. Then 4 more off the one beside it. Then she goes back inside, and that is dinner. That garden is about 1/4 of an acre, and here is the thing that ought to stop us. It depends remarkably little on anything bought. The fence around it was grown, the poles holding up her beans were grown. Most of the soil under her boots was made right there, out of what the household would otherwise have thrown away. And if that garden fails, nobody drives anywhere. The family goes hungry, and every person under that roof knows it. There were about 20 methods holding a garden like that together. Most are gone now, and not because they stopped working. They stopped being necessary, and then, inside about 2 lifetimes, they stopped being remembered. One of the 20 was so simple and so quietly powerful that long after the Middle Ages were over, gardeners used that same principle to ripen a tropical fruit in the dead of an English winter. I will tell you which one when we get there. So let's walk that garden. Not the way a museum walks it, with little signs on posts. The way she walked it, starting with the thing she worried about first every single morning. Not the soil. The fence. A plot that valuable had enemies, and most of them had 4 legs. A fence of cut wood answers all of them for a while, but it starts dying the day you drive the first post. 10 years, maybe 15, and you are doing the whole job again with your shoulders 10 years older. So they grew the fence instead. You plant hawthorn in a line, let it come up a few years, and then you do something that looks like vandalism. You cut most of the way through each young trunk near the base. Not all the way. Most of the way. Then you bend the wounded stem over sideways and weave it between stakes. And the tree does not die. It heals lying down. It throws new shoots straight up out of the bend. They knit into the ones either side, and within a few seasons you have a living wall a bull will lean on and think better of. Now hold this next part, because it is the whole argument of everything we are about to talk about. A wooden fence is worth the most on the day you finish it. A living hedge is worth the least on the day you finish it. Every year after, it gets thicker, stronger, better. It feeds birds. It shelters the bed behind it. And there are hedges standing in Britain right now, doing that same job on that same line in the ground that were laid before anybody in your family tree spoke English. Now, I am not going to send a 70-year-old at a hedge with a billhook, but the idea underneath it costs nothing. If you have a stretch of rotting fence you are dreading replacing, ask your extension office what shrubs are native to your area and plant a mixed line in front of it. In 8 years, you will have a windbreak that never needs a receipt again. Of course, that hedge needed stakes. The beans needed poles. Every basket and gate needed rods, and there was no lumberyard, so they grew that too. Cut a hazel clean off at the ankle, and the hazel does not die either. It gets angry. It sends up a ring of straight new shoots, and in about 7 years those shoots are poles. Cut them, and the stump simply does it again, and again. There are coppice stools in English woods that have been cut and regrown on that cycle for more than 700 years, and they are still alive, still producing. The medieval garden did not buy its infrastructure. It grew its infrastructure on a stump that outlived everybody who ever cut it. The backyard version takes one afternoon. A willow, a mulberry, an elderberry, a red osier dogwood, anything with that vigorous suckering habit, cut hard to a low stump in late winter. Every year after, you walk out and harvest bean poles and tomato stakes for nothing. My father called it the stake patch, and I never once saw him buy a stake. So now we have rods. Piles of them, every year, whether we want them or not. And this is where the garden starts to look like the pictures in the old manuscripts, because those rods got woven. Over, under, over, under. The same motion as a basket, only bigger. And out of that one skill came almost every hard object in the garden. The low fence around the plot. The woven edges holding the beds up. The supports the peas climbed. And overhead, the arbor. That last one gets forgotten, and it should not. Those gardens were full of tunnels and arches of woven rods with vines running over them. And they were not only decoration, they were shade, which, if you garden anywhere south of about Kentucky, is not a quaint detail. A simple arch of rods over the west end of a bed will keep your lettuce from bolting weeks longer than your neighbor's. So we are standing inside a fenced, furnished, self-supplying garden, which is still, at this point, a box of dirt. And the dirt is where they were doing something more sophisticated than most of us manage now. Start with the shape. There is a plan drawn for an ideal monastery in the 9th century, and its kitchen garden is 18 neat raised beds, narrow for one reason that has nothing to do with looks. A gardener kneeling on the path had to reach the middle without ever putting a boot on the growing soil. The paths take the weight, so the beds never pack down and never need breaking open again. Which gives you a test you can do in your slippers. If you have to step into a bed to reach the middle, it is too wide. Then there is what went into those beds. And this is where a modern gardener has to be careful, because the story has a turn in it. Everything went in. Kitchen scraps, spent straw, animal bedding, sweepings off the floor. And above all, manure, which was not treated as waste, but as money. Because it was money. Manor records track it. And within days, the middle of a fresh heap runs hot enough that you cannot hold your hand in it. Hot enough to steam on a frozen morning. The finest of it came out of a tower. Dovecotes. Round stone towers lined inside with hundreds of nesting holes. The birds flew out every day, fed themselves on somebody else's grain, and came home every night to leave concentrated fertilizer in one pile on the floor. Except it was not free, and this is where it stops being charming. In much of medieval Europe, a dovecote was a lord's privilege. The birds ate the peasants' grain, and the peasants were forbidden to touch them. And in France, that resentment was still on the list of grievances when the revolution finally came. Now here is the turn, and I want you to hear it clearly, because it may be the most useful thing in this entire video. The free material that saved a garden 600 years ago can now destroy one. There is a family of broadleaf weed killers used on pasture and hay ground. They kill the thistles and leave the grass standing. Then the animal eats that grass, and the chemical goes straight through the animal and out the other end into the manure. It survives the digestion. It survives sitting in a pile. It survives a hot compost heap, which kills nearly everything else. And months later, it is still strong enough, at almost unimaginably small traces, to curl the growing tips of your tomatoes into little ferns and shut your beans down for the season. Tomatoes, potatoes, peas, beans, and lettuce show it first, and it can sit in your soil a year or two afterward. So here is the test. 3 weeks and 1 flower pot. Before you spread a load of somebody else's manure, straw, hay, or bagged compost, fill a pot with it, plant 3 bean seeds, and set it on the windowsill. If the beans come up straight and green, you are fine. If they come up twisted and cupped and stunted, you just saved your whole garden with 1 pot. And ask the person selling it one plain question. Was this ground sprayed for broadleaf weeds? If they do not know, walk away. Manure was the rich side. The mineral side came out of the fire and out of the earth, ash from the hearth. And for sour ground, marl, a lime-rich clay dug out of pits and spread to sweeten the soil. The old marl pits still dimple the English countryside by the thousand. Little ponds in the middle of fields, and most people driving past have no idea they are looking at a soil amendment somebody dug by hand. They dredged those ponds too, and the black silt off the bottom went onto the vegetables. Nothing on that list was bought. The garden was simply plumbed into every waste stream the family already produced. Now, I want to tell you about the one I cannot get out of my head, because everything so far has been a gardener improving a garden. This next one is something else. Across the sandy country of the Low Countries and northern Germany, the soil was poor. Thin, hungry, pale sand that would not hold a crop. And what those households did about it was not really a technique. It was a decision. They went out to the heath with a spade and cut the turf. Not the grass, the whole sod, roots, soil, and all. They carried it home and threw it down on the floor of the byre. And all winter the cattle stood on it and trampled it and soaked it through. In the spring, they forked that black, sodden, ruined mess out of the barn and spread it on the field. And the field came up. A little. Less than the thickness of your finger. So they did it again the next year, and the year after. And their children did it. And their children's children did it. For centuries. And the fields rose. Slowly, invisibly, one thin layer at a time, until the topsoil on those old plots was deeper than a man is tall. You can go and look at them. The old fields still sit up above the land around them like low tables. And where they meet the road, there is a step. And that step is made out of nothing but 1,000 years of somebody's patience. The soil is still rich. It is still farmed. Now think about the man who started it. Out on that heath with a spade on a cold morning, cutting sod for a field that will not be finished in his lifetime, or his sons, or his grandsons. He knew that. There is no version of this where he did not know that. He was not feeding a crop. He was building something his great-grandchildren would inherit, and he would never see it. We buy topsoil now, by the bag. We pay somebody to dig it up somewhere else, put it in plastic, drive it across 3 states, and set it on a pallet outside a store. And nothing on that pallet is being built. So here is the only piece of this you need, and it is almost embarrassingly simple. Stop trying to fix a bed in one weekend. 1 inch a year. Every autumn, a thin layer over the top. Leaves, clippings, finished compost, whatever you have. Do not dig it in. Lay it down and let the worms take it under. 1 inch a year, and never stop. 10 years of that and you will have a bed you can put your arm into up to the elbow, and you will not be able to point to the day it happened, because there was no such day. That is the method. It is just very hard to sell. Now, we have a fence. We have beds. We have soil that is going somewhere. When do you plant? There were no printed frost dates and no zone maps. There was the calendar of saints, and a village full of people who had watched the same fields their whole lives. Sow this by one saint's day, harvest that by another, and the year hung on those pegs the way ours hangs on numbers. But underneath the saints' days was something better, and older, and it still works. They planted by what the land itself was doing. When a certain tree broke into leaf, when the blackthorn flowered. Because a date on a page does not know what kind of spring you are having. A tree does. A lot of you will recognize this, because your people did the same thing and got it out of the almanac hanging on a nail by the kitchen door. Plant your corn when the oak leaves are the size of a squirrel's ear. Put your peas in when the lilacs leaf out. That is not folklore for its own sake. That is a thermometer with roots on it. And it matters more now than it did 20 years ago, because an average frost date is an average of a climate that has been drifting. Your lilac is not working from an average. It is working from this year. Write down what 2 or 3 plants in your own yard do, and when, and you will have a calendar that belongs to your ground and nobody else's. Now look at how they arranged what went in, because a medieval bed would fail a modern seed packet inspection completely. It was crowded on purpose. Cabbages, leeks, onions, herbs, and pot flowers all tangled together in the same ground. Tall things shading the ones that hated heat. Quick crops pulled out of the gaps before the slow ones needed the room. Bare soil loses water and grows weeds, so there was no bare soil. Now, plenty of people will tell you that mixing plants confuses pests, and here is where the advice goes soft. The broad principle holds up, but most of the specific pairings on those charts have never been shown to do much of anything. They just get copied from list to list. So do not chase the charts. Never leave your soil naked, and tuck a fast crop into every gap. And some of what stood in those beds never came out at all. A whole family of vegetables has dropped almost entirely out of American gardens, and they were the backbone of the daily pot. Skirret, a sweet root you plant once and dig from for years. Good King Henry, which comes up every spring like asparagus and asks nothing of you. They did not vanish because they taste bad. They vanished because nobody can sell you the seed again next March. A plant you buy once and harvest for 20 years is a terrible product and a wonderful vegetable. Give 1 corner of 1 bed to something perennial this year. And buy the plants from a nursery, please. Several of these have relatives in the wild that will hurt you. Which brings me to the most expensive thing in that entire garden. It was smaller than your thumbnail. Saffron. The 3 little threads out of the middle of an autumn crocus. It takes a great many flowers to make 1 ounce, every flower picked by hand in the cold, and it has always been worth more by weight than nearly anything else that grows. And medieval English gardeners grew it themselves. There is a market town in Essex that grew so much of it, and got so rich on it, that the town changed its name to say so. It is still called that today. The oldest gardening poem we have in English, written down about 600 years ago by a man remembered only as John the Gardener, explains how to grow it. He assumed somebody would always need to know. And you can do it. The corms go in around August and flower in October, and a few square feet of sunny bed will give you something most of us cannot afford to buy. One firm warning: buy corms from a proper supplier, and never dig anything like this out of a field. There is another autumn bulb that looks remarkably similar, and it is seriously poisonous. So the garden is planted, and now the weather starts, trying to take it back. Which is where the walls come in. We assume they were about keeping people out. Partly. But a stone wall facing the sun does something else all day, quietly. It absorbs heat, hour after hour, and all night long it gives that heat back to whatever stands against it. The strip at the foot of a south-facing wall is a different climate from the ground 12 feet away. Warmer nights, earlier springs, later autumns. So gardeners learned to spread fruit trees flat against that stone until every leaf sat inside the warm pocket. And here's the part I love. You already own the wall, the south side of your house, your garage, your board fence. That is the warmest ground on your property, and most of us grow nothing there but grass and a downspout. Put your tomatoes there. Put a fig, or the pepper that never quite ripens for you. You will pick 2 weeks ahead of your whole street. But a wall only borrows heat from the sun. What did they do when there was no sun to borrow? Remember that manure heap, steaming on a frozen morning? They noticed. And what they did with that is, to my mind, the cleverest thing in this entire video. You take fresh horse manure with the straw bedding still through it, pile it into a deep bed, tread it down firm, and cap it with a few inches of fine soil. And underneath, the whole mass begins to work. And it does not stop for weeks, sometimes months. It is a furnace. A slow, wet, silent furnace that costs nothing and rebuilds itself free every spring. So you sow into that warm cap in the dead of winter, and the seed comes up as though it were May. Salad in February. Melons weeks ahead of any neighbor who had to wait for the sun. And out beyond the frame, the ground is still hard as a road. They called it a hotbed. And here is where I pay off what I promised you at the start. Long after that woman was picking kale in the frost, gardeners in England and Holland took that same principle, fermenting waste under a bed of soil, and pushed it as far as it would go. They layered horse manure with spent oak bark from the tanning yards, put glass over the top, and they ripened pineapples. Tropical pineapples, in a northern European winter, on rotting rubbish. And one of those pineapples was worth an outrageous fortune. Years of a working man's wages, for a single piece of fruit grown in a country where it had no business existing. The furnace was free. The fruit was the expensive part. We burn gas to heat greenhouses now, to do the job a heap of stable sweepings did for nothing. Your version is smaller and perfectly doable. A cold frame, or an old storm window laid over a box, sitting on a base of half-rotted leaves and manure. Sow spinach and hardy greens in late winter and you will be cutting salad while everybody else is still reading catalogs. Give fresh manure real time before you plant, and everything I said about sprayed hay goes double. By June, the beds had the opposite problem. Not cold, dry. And the answer fit in one hand. A small clay jug, pierced with holes in the base and one hole at the neck. You dunk it in the rain barrel, press your thumb over the neck hole, and the water simply stays inside. Carry it to the bed, lift your thumb, and it rains gently, exactly where you point it. One hand watering, one hand free. Museums have them. And we chase that same idea now with plastic line, emitters, a pressure regulator, and a timer that needs a battery. The physics fit inside a piece of fired clay 600 years ago. The direct descendant of that jug is the best watering advice I can give an older gardener. 2 unglazed terracotta pots, drain hole plugged, glued rim to rim, buried in the middle of the bed with just the top showing. The clay weeps water only as fast as the soil pulls it, straight down at the roots, nothing lost to the sun. Fill it once a week. Then sit down. That is the whole job. The other thing that came for that garden was not weather. It had legs. And I will be honest about what they knew, because it is more interesting than pretending. The old books are stuffed with remedies. Powders, washes, things buried at the corners of the bed, things said aloud over the ground. And most of them did nothing whatsoever. Which is how you get one of the strangest facts in the history of growing food. When the remedies failed, some communities took the insects to court. Actual court. A summons issued to the caterpillars, a lawyer appointed to speak for them, and a ruling handed down when they failed to appear. And I find that moving rather than funny. That is not stupidity. That is what desperation looks like when the crop is the only thing standing between your children and a hungry march, and you have run out of every other idea. What actually worked was the dull part nobody bothered to write down. Being out there, early, hands on the plants, looking, and putting something physical between the pest and the crop. 600 years on, 10 minutes at first light with a bucket of soapy water and a length of row cover still beats most of what comes in a bottle. So the garden has survived the frost, the drought, and the caterpillars. Now the gardener wants more of whatever did well. And this next one changed the world quietly, and almost nobody thinks about it. Apples do not come true from seed. Plant a pip out of the best apple you ever ate and you will get a tree, and its fruit will be a stranger, usually a poor one. Which means that without grafting, every named apple on earth would have died with its one original tree. Every single one. So they cut a shoot off a tree that bore well, sliced it onto the trunk of a worthless seedling, matched the living edges where the sap runs, bound the joint with clay, and the good shoot took over. Monasteries traded those cuttings across Europe the way libraries traded books, and that old poem gives grafting more room than it gives cabbages, because it mattered that much. So here is the thing I would like to leave in your head. There are apples being eaten this autumn, in American kitchens, from varieties carried forward graft by graft for 500 years. Not seed, not descendants. Cuttings. An unbroken chain of living tissue, hand to hand, gardener to gardener, since before this country existed. An old orchard is not a group of trees. It is an archive somebody kept alive on purpose, one winter at a time, and not one of them is still here to be thanked for it. Now the practical part, and it will save you real money. The tree you buy at the nursery is not one plant, it is two. The variety on top, and underneath it a different tree called the rootstock. And the rootstock decides how tall that tree gets, how soon it fruits, how long it lives, and whether it can stand your soil. Most people never ask. They did the same thing with seed, except seed let them do something grafting could not. There was nowhere to buy seed, so the best plants in the bed were deliberately not eaten, which, in a hungry spring, took a discipline I am not certain I have. Do that for generations, saving only from what thrived in your soil, your weather, your shade, and the plants change. They tighten around your particular ground. Seed banks now hunt down the last of those old local strains, like treasure. A medieval family ran that program by accident, for free. Start with beans, peas, or lettuce. 2 honest cautions. Seed off a hybrid packet will not come back true, so begin with something open, pollinated. And squash and brassicas cross with the neighbors enthusiastically. And now we come to the part most people miss entirely about old gardens. Because growing the food was only ever half the job. A garden gets about 30 weeks of growth to cover 52 weeks of eating. That is the real arithmetic, and everything from here is about closing that gap. So they did not harvest the greens as whole plants. They picked the outer leaves and left the plant rooted, and it kept throwing new leaves from the center, week after week, from March into winter. Pull a cabbage and you eat once. Pick its leaves and you eat all year off the same root. Which is exactly what our woman was doing in the frost. And they sowed the same way. Little and often, so something was always coming up behind the thing being eaten. 50 zucchini ripening in 1 week of August is a planning failure they could not afford. Sow a short row, wait 2 weeks, sow another. That one change will do more for your kitchen than any fertilizer. Out beyond the beds, the orchard was doing the same trick with space. Under the fruit trees grew grass, and on the grass grazed geese. And the stacking was deliberate. 3 harvests off one piece of ground at once. Fruit overhead, meat below, and the droppings landing exactly where the trees wanted them. And the geese cleaned up the windfalls and the grubs inside them, which quietly broke next year's pest cycle. At the edge of it all sat the last tenant. Bees, in woven straw domes, paying rent twice, once in pollination and once in honey. Though taking that honey out usually killed the colony. The modern hive fixed that, and fixed it well. And that is one place where we are plainly ahead. You are not keeping geese. But 2 things off that page still work in a suburban yard. Pick up your fallen fruit, all of it, every week, and you break the same cycle the geese were breaking. And leave one small patch of bare, sunny, unmulched ground out of the way. Most of our native bees do not live in hives at all. They nest in the ground, and a bare, sunny patch is the whole invitation. And now it is November. And this is where a garden is actually judged. Not on what it grew, on what is left to eat in the months when nothing grows at all. So they built a clamp. You choose a dry spot with a bit of a rise to it. Pile your roots and cabbages into a mound on straw. Jacket the whole mound in a thick coat of more straw. Then seal that under packed earth, leaving a small chimney of straw at the top so the thing can breathe. And inside, in the dark, the temperature settles just above freezing and stays there. All winter. The harvest sits in there alive and dormant, and when you need food you open one end, take what the week requires, and seal it up again. No electricity. No building. No moving parts. A root cellar is nothing but this method moved indoors. The refrigerator did not really beat the clamp, it mostly just made it smaller, and asked you to pay for it every month for the rest of your life. Your version fits in a garage. A tub, damp sand, and your carrots and beets laid in so they are not touching, somewhere cold that never freezes. They will come out in February, crisp. 2 things. Do not store apples in with your roots, because apples give off a gas that makes roots sprout and turn bitter. And anything that froze solid and thawed goes on the compost. So, 20 methods. And I could stop here and let you pick a favorite, but I would be handing you the wrong thing, because the list was never the point. Stand back from all 20 at once and look at what they have in common. The hedge is thicker this year than last, and it will be thicker still when the person who laid it is gone. The coppice stool has been cut 100 times, and it is not finished. The seed in the jar fits that ground a little better every generation. The grafted tree in the corner will outlive the hands that bound the joint. And underneath all of it, the soil is one thin layer deeper than it was last autumn, and one thinner layer deeper than the autumn before that. Not one of those things was designed to be at its best in its first season. Every one of them was designed to be at its best in its 30th. We buy consumables now. Bagged, shipped, opened, used up by October, bought again in the spring. And there is nothing wicked in that. It is only that a consumable is worth the most on the day you carry it home. And everything in that garden was worth the most decades after everybody had forgotten who started it. So that is the real forgotten method. It was never the hedge, or the hotbed, or the clamp. It was building a garden that became worth more with time instead of less. They were not thinking in seasons, they were thinking in generations. And I will tell you what stays with me about that woman in the frost. She did not plant that kale. Somebody put it in the ground the spring before last, and then got on with their life. And here she is, 2 winters later, still eating off it. Half of what she is standing in was handed to her by people who are not there anymore. And she is out in the cold on a February morning, quietly adding to it, for somebody she may not live long enough to meet. So that is what I would leave you with. 1 inch a year. Something planted that outlives the planting. Go put a layer on a bed this autumn, friend. Nobody will notice for 10 years, and then everybody will. If you would like to keep sitting out here by the fence with me, subscribe, and I will see you next time. There is a free written companion waiting below with the whole thing laid out plain, and a little square code on the screen if that is easier than typing. It costs nothing. It was never meant to.